Welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading The Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. This book is out of print, but if you look, you can find used copies occasionally at used bookstores or perhaps Amazon's resellers. I just was on Amazon a couple of days ago, and I did find some. Today is July the 15th. So we are at chapter 28, and Saul has returned to Jerusalem after Jesus died, and he's been hearing the stories of what happened while he was there, and how his uncle, who was a very liberal Jew. He was a Sadducee who truly didn't believe in the Holy Spirit or perhaps even in God. And Jesus healed his grandson, and now he's converted, and he's very, very much a believer in Jesus as being the Son of God. So now we're going to move to chapter 28. Saul sat before Joseph of Arimathea in a condition of wild and frustrated passion and wrath, so fierce that it was almost malignancy. When he could speak, he had said in a voice that was unusually deep and hoarse, with repugnance and suppressed violence, "Forgive me. You have been my friend, Joseph of Arimathea, and I have been grateful, for I know I do not possess the graciousness and ease of other men, and you have shown me patience and kindness and often peace. Why this was, I do not know. I was content and happy that you accepted me for what I was, for others do not, alas. I trusted you above all other men except Rabban Gamaliel, and I trusted you above my father, may he rest in peace. I thought that not only were you a pious Jew and a Pharisee, but above self-deception, though I had detected a certain trustfulness toward him whom the Greeks called John the Baptist, though we know him as Jochanan ben Zachary. I believed you loved his removal from and rebellion against the Roman oppressor of our country, and therefore were indulgent in the face of his excesses and zeal. It is true that you spoke of the Messiah as imminent, but do we not all hope that? You frequently spoke in mysterious riddles, but that is the way of the older Jews, and I could bear with it, though I am a pragmatic man. I knew you loved and adored the Lord our God as deeply as any man could, and would defend his honor and his name to the death. Yet now, in this house today, you tell me to my face that Yeshua of Nazareth, vagabond, wandering ragged rabbi, deceiver, vainglorious madman, fraud, liar, and blasphemer, an unlearned Galilean, whom none knew until 3 years ago, is the Messiah, the Holy One of Israel? You tell me that you have known it from the beginning? You tell me that you gave him a fine tomb for what I knew would be only 3 short days? You tell me that not only did he rise from the dead, but you have seen him since his execution? If another man but you, Joseph of Arimathea, had told me of this, I would say you lie and you are mad." They sat in Joseph's small library, to which the bronze door had been closed. Joseph regarded Saul gently and silently, and his large, dark eyes seemed to wax and wane with inner lambency. He was not angered. He was very calm and in repose. He said, "Yes? And what do you say of me, Saul of Tarshish?" The lid of Saul's half-shut and afflicted eye visibly quivered, and there was a tight tremor about his mouth. "I do not know what to say," he replied, "except that I know that you do not lie. And what then is the answer? That you, a man of a great house in Israel, a gentleman, a man of culture and taste and learning, have been frightfully deceived and betrayed by scoundrels and mountebanks and necromancers of the basest sort. What is their object? To destroy Israel, to bring down the wrath of God upon us? Who pays them? The Romans, infidels, heathens, Parthians? We do not know, but I am certain there is someone. They are our enemies, and it could be they are enemies of all men. At the very least, they are mad." Joseph took Saul's goblet to refill it, but with a savage gesture, Saul refused more wine. He leaned forward to stare at Joseph with a bitter look. Joseph said, "I saw him in his resting place, with shepherds from the hill about him, in a manger, in a cave in Bethlehem. I had awaited him, as I told you, when I saw the glorious star. I had dreams. I saw him with his young mother. She was not past 14, a young girl in the full of her innocence and virginity. I saw him with his young adoptive father, Joseph, a carpenter. The shepherds knew him, for they had heard the good news from God's own angels in the wintry hills over Bethlehem. And they had come at once, without doubt and without scorn and without fear, as all simple men approach God. It is a divine simplicity. I found them kneeling and praying about the child mother and her infant, and I brought a gift, though he who made all gifts has need of none. I gazed at the child. There was but a lantern glow in the dark of the cave, and the night was cold and black outside. He was but a child, as all the sons of man are children, and yet—" Joseph paused, for the memory moved him almost beyond bearing. "I knew at once who he was. I had no doubt, no misgiving, no second thought, no hesitation, and I prostrated myself before him, the Holy One of Zion, the Holy One of Israel." Joseph gazed at some far distance, and his eyes filled with tears. He murmured, as he has said himself, "Blessed are those who see and believe. For more blessed are those who do not see, yet believe." Before I had seen him, I had believed. And when I saw him, belief was confirmed instantly. I knew where he was during his childhood. I saw him before he was bar mitzvah in the temple, a boy questioning the wise men and answering them. I know where he was for the years wrapped in mystery, but I am not permitted to say. I know where he went after his ascension, a place as yet unknown to men, for he has said, "I have sheep you know not of." I knew when he resumed his trade as a carpenter to support himself and his mother. There was not an hour that I was not conscious of him. Saul of Tarshish, that is all I dare tell you. But the promise of the ages has been fulfilled, and the Lamb of God has saved his people from their sins and has turned death into eternal life. Blessed be his name. Saul was so horrified, so enraged at this, which he considered the foulest of blasphemies, and so afraid before Joseph's words for the fear of God's instant punishment, that he sprang to his feet abruptly, and the chair fell back from him and crashed to the marble floor. He put his hands over his ears, my God," he cried, "that these ears have heard so monstrous a story, even from you, Joseph of Arimathea. May God forgive me that I have listened. May God not forgive those who have so evilly deceived and confused you. I shall avenge you, my nephew, Amos ben Ezekiel, my sister, my unfortunate kinsmen, and all those of my countrymen who have been so wronged by a dead dissembler and hypocrite and madman and rogue. I shall destroy his followers as they have sought to destroy us and defame God. Invite his vengeance upon us." Saul lifted his hand and swore the most solemn and terrible oath he had ever uttered, and then said, "From this day hence he, the dead malefactor, has no greater enemy than I, nor have his wretched disciples." Joseph waited in silence, and then in a voice both mournful and gentle he said, "Saul ben Hillel, I know this. One day he will have no greater friend than you." With a cry of smothered agony and despair, Saul flung himself out of that house and into the warm late summer wind and sea-burdened rain. He pulled his hood over his head and wrapped himself tightly in his plain cloak. He hurried through the streets, but had no destination. He had thought 1,000 times of going to see Rabban Gamaliel, but for some reason even he could not understand. He shrank from the thought. The celebrated Nazi of the temple, would he not confirm Saul's horror and rage against the blasphemers? Would he not denounce the miserable man, Yeshua ben Joseph of Nazareth? Why then this most cringing reluctance to go to the Rabban, who could offer him consolation and a glimpse of sanity and soothe his pain and fury? He did not know. Instead, Saul went to the house of the high priest Caiaphas, who had induced Pontius Pilate, after his much argumentative exhaustion and imploring, to order the execution of Yeshua the Nazarene on the charge of inciting the people to rebellion against Rome. It was a long distance to that house, through the gray rain and wind, and the throngs hurrying to shelters and to their homes. Camels were squealing as they were tugged vigorously in the narrow streets. Asses complained and boys whipped. Saul dodged through the marketplaces, through the growing darkness. He reached the house of the high priest. It was, in truth, a palace, surrounded by high walls and guards, and it shone in the twilight, wet and white like alabaster. The gardens were pungent with freshly aroused fragrances, and the trees lashed and clattered in the wind. The guards were instantly suspicious and contemptuous of this wild man at the gates, with his wet red hair clinging to his brow and his cheeks and his neck, his unprepossessing, if powerful face, and his workman's clothing. But he said to them imperiously, "Tell your lord that Saul of Tarshish, grandson of his friend Shebuah ben Abraham, desires to see him on a matter of much importance." Saul waited while one of the sneering guards went to the house with the message. His heart was tumultuous. He kept drawing great audible breaths, and the other guards looked at him curiously, their helmeted heads cocked. Saul was thinking, in all the world there was none he despised more than Caiaphas, the son-in-law of the legendary and ruthless Annas, who was mightier than Herod Antipas himself. Saul considered the high priest the most despicable of traitors to his people, the sycophant of Rome. The vestments of the high priest reposed at the will of the Romans, in the fortress of Antonius, next to the temple. He was high priest so long as the Romans permitted him to be so. He was their servant. He was hostage for the obedience and docility and submission of all Israel. He was paid by the Romans. To offend the Romans would be to cast out of this beautiful palace, to become a beggar, to be divested of all monies and glory and power, to be shamed forever. But was that not preferable to treason against his people, to infamy against God? Nonetheless, he, Saul ben Hillel, needed this detestable man in order to protect his country and to keep the name of God from blasphemy. Caiaphas, a sepulchral but stately man of about 45 years, and with a carefully shaped gray beard and fine, apparently artless, blue eyes, received Saul with unexpected courtesy. He conducted Saul from the atrium, a magnificent room, into a secluded chamber bright with silk and velvet and murals and Persian rugs, and a guard obsequiously closed the door. "I know of your illustrious house, Saul ben Hillel," he said in a very rich and unequitous voice. "Your grandfather has no dearer friend than I." Wine was brought in jeweled goblets, but Saul, struggling to conceal his hatred and scorn, motioned it aside with impatience. He sat in a beautiful chair, dripping with rain, and offered no apologies. Caiaphas was a shrewd man and very subtle, and he only lifted his eyebrows and smiled affectionately. He recognized Saul for what he was, and not deceived by the rude garments and the rough gestures and the voice. Caiaphas adjusted his tall, oval, and pointed Pharisee hat of white silk embroidered in gold, and waited with paternal expression. He had no doubt at all that Saul had something of immense importance to tell him. He was not disappointed. He listened acutely, not only to Saul's words, but to his inflections, and he thought, "Here is the one for whom I have been seeking." When Saul had concluded, and the brightening lamplight was glittering in his eyes, Caiaphas sighed and affected to be overcome with weariness, and bent his head and rubbed his forehead. A beautiful ring sparkled and shone on his right index finger. "Alas," he said, and there was a deep throb in his voice, "the dangerous days have not departed from our afflicted and holy land, Saul ben Hillel. In truth, I am afraid the danger is increasing. Pilate angrily accused me of knowing that his followers had removed the body of Yeshua of Nazareth from the tomb, though later he apologized. But he was distraught. His accusations, he knew, were both unjust and hysterical, for had not I delivered the malefactor into his hands? Why then should I plot to make it seem that he had risen from the dead, as he had prophesied? Ah, those were sad hours. Yeshua's wretched followers fled Jerusalem, but now my spies say that they are returning, that they are seen worshiping in the temple again with their fellow Jews on whom they had brought disaster. They engage in soft harangues, trying to convince their brothers that Yeshua ben Joseph was indeed the Holy One of Zion. To reject him, they plead, is to reject God himself, blessed be his name. Unfortunately, and to my terror, hundreds are being convinced. They had seen Yeshua himself and had listened to his uncouth utterances in the streets and in the temple. Did you know that he had the effrontery and outrageous impudence to drive the currency changers from the temple, and the sellers of sacrifices, and the bankers. He shrieked that they were making his father's house a den of thieves. I have heard, said Saul. Caiaphas peeped at him from under his hand. And have you heard, Saul ben of Tarshish, that my dearest friend, your grandfather, and your grandfather's family have been seduced into madness of believing that Yeshua of Nazareth is the Messiah? Saul flushed darkly. I know, he said. That is why I am here. They must be convinced that they are the victims of a low necromancer in collusion with a thief of a servant in their own home. Caiaphas sighed, as if with pain, and dropped his hand and gazed mournfully at the frescoed ceiling. There are others, even of equally distinguished family, he said, who shall deliver us from this madness. I have told you, Lord, said Saul. Ah, yes. You are a Roman citizen, an officer of the Roman law and Roman courts. He looked at Saul. Did you know that my brother-in-law, Judas Iscariot, hanged himself after the arrest of Yeshua? Rash young man, an Essene. He had left his father's house, his father Annas, and his mother's devotion to live in the desert with other savage creatures like himself. He became one of Yeshua's disciples. He believed this Yeshua was the Messiah. Judas was proud and a haughty young man. How he had convinced himself of that appalling blasphemy, I do not know. But he was always hasty and uncontrollable and pampered. To force Yeshua to reveal himself as the Messiah, Judas contrived to deliver him into my hands. He thought that if Yeshua were seized and arrested, and the very angels would descend to rescue him. Ah. And when Yeshua was flogged by the Romans, and a crown of thorns thrust on his head, then Judas, tragic young man, knew that there was no Messiah, no Holy One of Zion, but only a cheap magician and a spinner of foolish tales, a deceiver, a man of delusions and conceit. According to the law, I had to give Judas the prescribed 30 pieces of silver, which is the reward for the exposure of a blasphemer. And Judas burst into the most awful tears and flung the money into my face and ran from me with great howls of despair and torment. When I think of my wife's brother, Judas Iscariot, so distraught over his own betrayal by Yeshua, my heart bleeds with sorrow. For the first time there was a genuine distress in his voice. He seemed surprised at this himself. He smiled faintly at Saul. Tomorrow I will have the letter from the procurator, Pontius Pilate, in my hands, with your staff of authority and a parchment proclaiming that you are the Roman prosecutor of troublemakers and rebels in all of Israel, Saul of Tarshish. May God, blessed be his name, strengthen you in your holy task, in your firm determination to rid our afflicted land of blasphemers who would destroy her. He embraced Saul with secret elation. Saul of Tarshish, Roman citizen and lawyer. Saul ben Hillel, grandson of the noble Shabuah ben Abraham. What more formidable man than this could be on the side of the angels and on the side, of course, of the high priest of Caiaphas? But it was Pontius Pilate himself who graciously summoned Saul to him and invested him with his own hands in the robe of office, gave him the rod of authority, and had him repeat the oath of fealty to Rome. The latter made Saul turn very white, but he forced himself to remember it was only the price he must pay to defend his God. He would pray on the next day of atonement to be loosed from the oath demanded of him. Then Pilate informed him that as an officer openly in the service of Rome, he would have an entourage of legionnaires who would seize and arrest at his will, and Saul, therefore, would live in a suitable house in Jerusalem, kindly bestowed on him by the procurator. "I do not believe, Lord," said Saul, "that the matter will consume much time. A few weeks, perhaps a month or so." Pilate was a dark, thin man, somewhat tall, with a bald head and an elusive expression, and a large Roman nose, a tight, wide smile. He smiled at Saul's words, then shook his head. "Alas, Saul of Tarshish, I am not so sanguine. News of Jesus of Nazareth and his death and alleged arising from the dead has spread far and wide, and converts among the Jews increase in number daily. I have also heard that their fellow Jews in other countries also. Let me repeat that. I have also heard that they have left Israel in many numbers to proselytize among their fellow Jews in other countries also. It is as if reports of him have been borne on the wind, and the wind is becoming a hurricane." His palace was stately and magnificent, and the hall where he had received Saul was the grandest the young man had ever seen. Pilate walked from him immediately, meditatively, pacing and down to the vast room. He said, "I have just returned from Caesarea, and have seen and heard remarkable things there from a Greek physician who was a guest in my house. But it is of no moment. The peace and tranquility of Israel is our purpose, yours and mine, Saul ben Hillel, and I entrust the matter in your hands for so long as you desire it." He turned to Saul and seemed about to ask a question, and then refrained. Saul bade him farewell. Pilate watched his going, and he pursed his lips, then made a wry expression. How these Jews adored and defended their God! How they hated blasphemy! It was absurd. It was laughable. Certainly Marcus Tullus Cicero, a century before, had been accused of blasphemy in Rome, and had almost been tried on the charge. But Rome had thrown off that stupidity, had become fully enlightened in these past 100 years or less. No nation coveting the name of civilization would endure such childish abominations any longer, except for these Jews. Long before Rome, they related, they had been a nation and a people, and had possessed their God, yet they had not progressed in the arts of urbanity and tolerance. Had they done so, the word blasphemy would be a jest now, and not the gravest of charges. A murderer, a true malefactor, the worst of thieves and degenerates, were not regarded by them as loathsome as a heretic could often receive mercy. But heretics were stoned to death in public places. Incredible. "If I remain here longer," thought Pilate, "I shall lose my wits also." Suddenly he recalled again the man who had been a guest in his house, and he sat down to think and to frown and to pull his lip, and to fear as he had feared then. That night Saul prayed with the greatest ardor of his life, and with all-consuming power and exultation and conviction. "God of my fathers, God of Abraham, Jacob, and David, God of Sinai and Moses, King of kings, creator of the universe, Redeemer of Israel, my Lord and my God, I know your will for me, and I know your will for me, that I rid your holy land of blasphemers and idolaters, of your wickedest enemies, of your defamers, as you have commanded in the past, and you command this day. O joy of joys, that I have known this hour, that you have spoken your will to me. I shall hunt out this Yeshua ben Joseph of Nazareth, who was conveyed still alive from his tomb, and hidden in order to deceive the simple, and I shall expose him to the light of your ineffable day. so that all may see. I shall bring all to justice, so that your land will be cleansed and worthy again of your blessing, my Lord and my God." It seemed to him that there was a profound tenderness near him, a profound sweetness which thrilled through his flesh and his bones and almost consumed him with delight, that a divine gravity had been turned toward him and awaiting. He fell to the floor of his chamber and lay in utter peace, a peace he had not known for a long time, a peace he could not remember. Somewhere, something imminent had moved in his direction and was gazing upon him, and he buried his face in his arms, both afraid and desiring to see the vision. And that's the end of chapter 28. Please join me for chapter 29. Thank you.